Okay, so in part two of God is a Woman, I want to talk about the Gaia Theory. Before I begin talking about the Gaia Theory, I want to point out a Bible passage in Leviticus 18 through 28, verse 28, that talks about how if you defile the land, then the earth will vomit you out. And that goes really hand in hand with the Gaia theory, which posits this idea that the Earth is a self regulating entity. The Gaia theory is a scientific hypothesis that proposes Earth and its biological systems behave as a single self regulating entity, which was formulated by James Lovelock in the 1970s. And it is named after the Greek goddess Gaia, who personified the earth. So then it begs the question, well, how does this self regulation ultimately work? Well, you ultimately have these living organisms, right, that interact with their inorganic surroundings to maintain conditions that are ultimately suitable for life. You think about, in science, you could think about things like, atmospheric composition, ocean salinity, and Earth's global temperature. And so, as you have these living organisms that are then interacting with their surrounding environments, that there is then a degree of balance that is then created or needed to then maintain these stable conditions to foster life for the survival of these living organisms. Homeostasis is the interconnectedness of life forms and their environment to create stable conditions over longer periods of time. So you could think about, for example, our weather patterns. Like, right now we're talking really big about climate collapse and how the climate and the weather patterns are out of balance now. And that's ultimately because all of these systems within this self regulating entity that we call Earth, right? That they interact with one another and they're ultimately designed in such a way to create a degree of balance that helps to maintain and support life here on Earth. That balance is then homeostasis. And so when things get out of balance on Earth, right, within the climate, within the Earth structure, that there are ultimately systems that can then bring the Earth back into balance when things go haywire. So there are these feedback mechanisms that are ultimately present that can help to restore that natural balance. And it is that aspect that leads us to understand how Earth is a self regulating system. Now, there are two types of feedback mechanisms. There's positive feedback mechanisms, and then there's also negative feedback mechanisms. We'll start with the negative. So, for example, within a negative feedback mechanism, if Earth's temperature begins to rise, there are geophysical processes that might be triggered to then cool Earth back down to bring it back to a more stable temperature. More positive feedback mechanisms have more to do with the process of evolution. So, for example, certain changes amplified or certain changes are amplified, leading to tipping points where then the system then shifts into a new state. So you can think of things like how if there's a species that then dies out, there is another species that then reemerges to then make up the gap, right? That then adapts to this newer environment of how Earth is created. I ultimately think that kind of goes hand in hand with Charles Darwin's idea of evolution, how you then have a degree of new life then being emerged in this new state, and how when these tipping points are then reached, they push the earth into a new state where now you have new different types of plant species that are then able to emerge that make room for new types of animals to then emerge in new species. Also, that is can be seen in the Anthropocene, which is what we're experiencing now. So now within the current system that we have now, where we have where we're experiencing severe climate collapse, we are increasing our global temperatures in such a way that could ultimately, if we reach these tipping points, can alter our weather patterns, and they could become irreversible and push us into a new state of how the earth then has to regulate itself because the earth is a self regulating entity. So, one of the things I think is really interesting about Earth and the Gaia theory is that it suggests that these life forms, that we as life forms, are not necessarily passive entities, but that we interact with our environment and that we modify it in such a way to then promote our own survival here on the planet.